All right, Chair Witt, committee members, it's an honor to be here today. I'm going to give you a bit of background on sort of reasons that cause changes in mule deer population size. This isn't going to be a lecture on the math behind mule deer population dynamics. That would probably be pretty boring to everyone in the room, maybe besides me. But just for the record, I'm wildlife research program leader for the East region of the state, so I oversee all of our research projects that are going on over there with Rocky Mountain elk, mule deer, and various carnivore species. So a bit of background on mule deer. One of the reasons we're concerned is that we've been observing declining mule deer populations for a long time.
Could you give us your name once again, just for the record?
Darren Clark.
Thank you very much.
So population of mule deer peaked in the 1930s due to expanding shrublands throughout the Intermountain West. At the time, they were the most common game species in Western North America. During the last third of the 20th century, we've seen widespread population declines throughout the Western U.S. and Canadian provinces. And so the Western Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies keeps information on 23 states or Canadian provinces. Most states are below their stated management objectives, and population declines are still ongoing currently. And due to concern for mule deer, WAFWA, the Western Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, established the Mule Deer Working Group to try and identify factors that might be contributing to mule deer population declines. So this isn't a unique scenario to Oregon, but this is the trend for our mule deer population since the 1980s. The late 80s were sort of kind of the glory years for mule deer, where we had about 275,000 mule deer in the state. And we've subsequently declined quite a bit. The most recent decline, a lot of that's been driven by some hard winter events the last few years, especially the winter of 16-17 was extremely hard. We had to cut a lot of mule deer tags following that year due to large winter die-offs. And that's had some carryover effects too. That'll have long-term effects on pregnancy rates. The subsequent year, the animals are coming out of winter in bad shape. And so there is a time lag with these severe winter events that sort of carries on a bit. So hopefully we'll see a reverse in this trend and at least stabilize here shortly with some maybe more favorable weather conditions. So why might mule deer be declining? Here's some compelling hypotheses that have been put out by largely WAFWA and the Mule Deer Working Group. So issues related with winter range, so either declining quality or quantity of winter range. So human development is one of the big factors on winter range, that we're taking up winter range space. Around Bend is a classic example in Oregon. Changing forage conditions on summer range. This could be due to changing land use practices, less logging, so there's more ingrown forest, there's less forage available for mule deer. In more shrubland communities, we've got issues with wildfires that's replacing other sagebrush and other shrubs, and then exotic grasses coming in afterwards that are not palatable to mule deer. We also have carnivore populations that are recovering. So cougar populations have increased substantially since the 60s in our own state. We now have wolves recolonizing the state. So we do have more carnivores on the landscape, so more mouths to feed. They could be having an effect. Overharvest or poaching. This is actually an issue we have documented in Oregon through some of our work in South Central Oregon around the Bend area. There are some serious poaching issues that do occur down in that area. And excessive harvest or poaching will lead to population declines. Climate change, not just affecting mule deer, but lots of wildlife species. Several ways this could affect mule deer. We get changes in phenology that might be a mismatch, so the green up's not timed when they're having their fawns anymore, so there's not adequate forage resources for them to support lactation. But changing winter conditions could also influence overwinter survival and just general nutrition balances. So climate could probably interact in some strange ways. Competition with other ungulates. This includes elk, but also includes cattle. So they all have some dietary overlaps. They're eating similar things. Elk can also exclude mule deer from areas. Mule deer are subordinate to elk, and so the direct interactions, elk can be a bit aggressive towards mule deer occasionally. There's also just long-term effects of just long-term grazing, where plant composition might be changing over time, where we have fewer shrubs, which mule deer really prefer to eat. And lastly, some disease issues. And when this is mentioned, it's largely the context with chronic wasting disease, which is not a disease we currently have in Oregon, and hopefully can keep it at bay as long as we can. But we do have some disease issues in Oregon, but appears to be anything major currently with mule deer. So our current research trying to tackle these all simultaneously is a heavy lift, but sort of these ones that are highlighted there are some things that we are currently working on to see which ones might be playing a role in Oregon's mule deer right now. So that's looking at winter range, summer range habitat, predation, and then also competition with ungulates, specifically elk. And where we're able to do this, if you're not familiar with it, Starkey Experimental Forest and Range, it's been around for about 30 years now, but it's a fenced area where deer and elk cannot get through the fence. It's an 8-foot high woven wire fence, so we have complete control over the size of that population, which allows us to do manipulative experiments, which is rare in natural resource settings. It's fairly typical habitat of the Blue Mountains, so mix of ponderosa pine and then cool moist forests on north-facing slopes with some mixed and rangelands on some of the areas with shallow soil. So we do most of our work in the main study area, which is the larger orange part there. The northeast area is another controlled area where there's no public access at all. Main study area does have public access. We allow hunting in here every year. We do hunting research and a variety of other things. And then the other areas are close to public access, and we use those for winter feed sites for mule deer and elk, since the animals can't leave, and it's not traditional winter range for them. So just as a reminder, what we're trying to look at here is issues related to winter range, so declines in quality and quantity. Ours is going to be more of a quality issue here because we don't technically have winter range in the experimental forest. Then looking at the forage resources available to mule deer during the summer. We're also studying the carnivores and their effects on mule deer. And then the big thing we're looking at is competition with elk, because I said we have the ability to change our elk population because it's fenced in. So this is a long-term research project. We are currently in year 6 of our pre-treatment phase, where we have about 350 elk in our main study area. We're reducing that elk population this winter, and we're hauling the elk out to an adjacent area. We'll finish that up sometime this spring with the goal of getting down to about 75 to 100 elk. So this is a substantial reduction in our elk population to see if mule deer benefit from having fewer elk that they have to compete with. And over the course of the entire study, we're monitoring 3 components. So mule deer demography, and that's just their vital rates. So things like survival rates, the does and fawns, pregnancy rates, twinning rates, seeing if those things change once we reduce the elk herd size. We're looking at nutritional condition of plants actually on the ground, what's available to mule deer, and then changes in habitat use. So see if mule deer start using areas that elk were excluding them from using. And then looking at predation through cause-specific mortality and understanding how predator densities will vary a bit over time naturally or due to harvest. So seeing if there's years where we have fewer predators, is mule deer survival going to be higher those years? So how we're going through all this is we are placing GPS collars on adult female mule deer, which allows us to assess survival and cause-specific mortality and also get 8 GPS locations per day on them throughout the course of the year. Any of the does that are pregnant are then fitted with the vaginal implant transmitter, which is expelled at birth, alerts us that the fawn has been born, and then we go in there and try and capture one or both fawns. Which then we're putting collars on them, which allows us to monitor their survival and see ideally what has killed them also. So far, since 2014, I believe this is a total of 25 does have died, and this is sort of the breakdown there. Largely predation, primarily from coyotes and cougars. See a little bit of malnutrition in there. There's a large chunk of unknown predation that's largely occurring in the winter, and what's happening there is either due to access restrictions of snow, we're a little late getting there, and the animals get consumed pretty quickly, and then usually coyotes come in, even if they weren't responsible for it, they're also scavenging on any bones that might be left. So it's hard to know what exactly killed it. The other thing to point out about a lot of those unknown predations that are occurring in winter, they're usually starting to occur right about now, late February, March. We're starting to get towards the tail end of winter. Those deer are severely nutritionally stressed also. So if, the last fat reserves they tend to burn up is in their femur, so the marrow fat. And at some of these predation sites, if you break that open, you can tell that the animal's basically about to starve to death, but a predator ultimately did kill the animal. So a lot of those unknown predations are animals that are severely nutritionally stressed and are probably going to die regardless of the outcome of a predator doing it or them dying of malnutrition. So this figure here has got a lot going on, but this is our actual survival rates. So on the y-axis, we have monthly survival probabilities, the probability of surviving a month. And so that's all of the black dots up here is changes in survival. X-axis, we have the date. So that's just over time, starting in November 13 through November 2013 through November 2018. And the blue line, which is the secondary y-axis, is snowpack during the winters of interest. And so you see the peaks there, so that's mean snowpack. This is the winter of 16-17, which was our hardest winter of the year that we studied so far. And basically what the whole take home of this complicated figure is, the years where we get lots of snow, our survival of does drops. So hard winters are hard on mule deer. So nothing too surprising there. It's backed up by data outside the fence that 16-17 winter was extremely hard on mule deer. If winter's hard enough and long enough, they're going to struggle to make it through it. So on the winter nutrition sort of habitat side of things, some of our deer are supplementally fed during the winter. They voluntarily enter a feed site and they receive some food. It's not an unlimited amount of food. It's basically just enough to get them through the winter. But this is trying to get at that question of quality of the winter range habitat. So are these deer that are coming in and getting better food during the winter, are they going to perform better than the ones that stay out and just survive on natural vegetation during the winter? So we're assessing that through changes in, are the does that get fed, are they fatter leaving the winter? Do they have higher pregnancy rates? Do they have twins more frequently? Is their survival better? Is the survival of their offspring better? And if we are seeing those differences, it would suggest that potentially we have some limitations of not enough quantity or quality of winter range habitat for mule deer. And so far, we haven't seen much of an effect of this supplemental feeding. This is the biggest one we found here, and here we're looking at fawn survival. So again, it's a daily survival probability on the y-axis here. And we have two groups here. So the treatment group is the fawns that are born to does that come in and are fed during winter. And then the blue group is the ones that stay out all winter. The fawns born are the ones that stay out all winter. We see a little bit early on in the first few days of life that the fawns born to does that were supplementally fed during the winter have a little bit higher survival. And ultimately that leads to higher survival through the first year of life. So a bit of a potential effect there that supplemental feeding or better quality winter range is providing a benefit through increased fawn survival, but we didn't see any differences in pregnancy rates, body condition of the does, or twinning rates. Those were all fairly similar between the two groups. This was the only evidence we see of some potential effects of lack of winter range habitat. This is just the causes of mortality for the fawns. Quite a bit of predation in there from coyotes, and then the felids, that's bobcats and cougars combined, but that's actually all cougar mortality. We just didn't update the name on there yet. I'll do that the next time I have to show this figure. And again, some unknown causes of mortality. Those are just, we just find a dead fawn laying out in the woods. Didn't appear that they were diseased, but and that's a large number of the mortality we had. We just could not explain why they were dying. But we did have some unknown predation. Those are, again, cases where coyotes probably scavenged something else. A cougar probably killed it, and a coyote scavenged. We just can't accurately say which one did it. Interestingly, we had two fawns that got stomped to death by elk. We sent those into the vet lab, and they could clearly see hoof marks from getting stomped by a larger animal. Some disease issues, but largely it is a lot of predation mixed with just a bunch of fawns that tipped over and died for no reason that we could easily tell. So the other thing we're looking at is summer nutrition. So some key questions we're looking at is the body condition of these does entering winter linked to their use of the landscape? So the does that were living in, say, a better spot, had better resources, we'd expect them to have higher body fat than an adjacent one that had not as quality a habitat in their home range. We also can't answer it yet, but we want to see if the deer actually change their habitat use patterns once there's fewer elk. Are they able to access areas with better nutrition now that elk are not maybe monopolizing those areas? And finally, ultimately, did these changes in habitat use or nutritional patterns actually benefit mule deer populations? Ultimately, I mean, if they change their habitat use patterns and they're still declining populations, competition's probably not doing much. So ultimately, I link this back to changes in the mule deer population itself. But we can't answer this first question. We are seeing that mule deer, females that have access to better quality forage in their home range are entering winter and higher, they have more body fat. So these are all measurements of the furthest left panel is spring, so where their home range is placed during the spring season, then the summer, and then throughout spring and summer is the annual figure. And basically, what this is just showing is that those over here on the right, they have better forage in their home range, and they are indeed a little bit fatter than the ones that have lower quality forage in their home range. So there appear to be some nutritional issues going on here. The other thing we see with summer nutrition, and this was actually, this was kind of a tough one when we saw this. It was actually really depressing to think about for the mule deer right now. What we have here on the y-axis is dietary digestible energy, so energy stored within plants, broken down by 4 different vegetation types that occur in Starkey. And then we have 2 spring seasons and 2 summer seasons. The details aren't real critical, but those 2 lines I have on there are. The yellow line is the amount of energy a doe requires at peak lactation to support her and her fawn. We don't have enough forage in these years to support a doe while she's lactating. The blue line is maintenance requirements for an adult doe, just herself, not lactating. We're meeting those requirements, but this is one of the reasons we're probably seeing some struggles in our mule deer populations is our forage conditions aren't able to support them anymore to raise offspring.
So, Darren, has I can't imagine that the lines themselves have changed since the late 80s, but the ability to access adequate energy may have?
So several things that could be going on here. There could be long-term effects of browsing from cattle and elk that have reduced, say, shrubs on the landscape for mule deer. I don't have reference data from the 80s to know anything.
Sure.
But and some of this might just be seasonal too. These 2 years might not be as good. So this is 2016, 2017. There could be some drought conditions. Some years plants are just going to grow better. They might be of higher quality some years also. So at least in these 2 years, it wasn't sufficient. But this probably wasn't a unique situation just to Starkey. It was probably similar in the Blue Mountains for these years. And this past year, I just being out in the field, seeing what was going on, forage conditions were a lot better in the summer of 2019. Had a lot more growth of grasses and shrubs. Things looked a lot better. So the deer probably did a bit better this year, but we didn't collect any nutrition data this summer. We'll probably collect some more again here in a couple years to see where we're at. But climate change might be affecting some of this too. Prolonged drought's going to decrease the quality of the forage available. But the shocking take home here is we're probably struggling for forage resources. There are other forest management practices, so things like timber harvest where you open up the canopy a little bit, not necessarily clear cuts or anything, but mule deer appear to like about 40% canopy cover from some of our other work. That does allow increased light penetration to the forest floor, and you'll get more shrubs and things growing that is more palatable to deer. We've also seen some effects, at least in the forested areas in the Blue Mountains, from past timber harvest where there was clear cutting. Those areas have really grown so ingrown with conifers now due to fire suppression also. All you have is, dense thickets of conifers that deer aren't going to eat for the most part. So that could be leading to some of the lack of forage also. So it's complicated.
Yeah.
Like all things mule deer, it's complicated. But it does highlight the need. We probably need to get some better forage conditions for mule deer. Okay, going to switch now to sort of the predation side of things. A lot of this is sort of preliminary results for us. We're still collecting this. But one of the things we want to know is how many carnivores on the landscape. Not only is this important for mule deer, but it's important for us to be able to effectively manage the carnivores too, to say how many we have. So we're developing some methods there. The key thing we're trying to figure out, though, is as carnivore densities sort of naturally fluctuate a little bit over time, is seeing if deer survival changes accordingly with that. So if you have a year where you have a few less cougars on the landscape, is doe survival going to be higher? Is fawn survival going to be higher? If you see those links, then predation likely is having an effect. But if you don't, it would suggest all the predation is compensatory mortality. Those deer were going to die from something else anyway. So that's one of the things we're trying to do, and it takes a time series of data. That's why this is all preliminary. We have to collect a few years of data to get variation in carnivore densities. We also just want to know what carnivores are most likely to eat mule deer. We have several out there now. We have black bears, bobcats, cougars, coyotes, and now wolves coming into areas, especially, well, they're getting throughout most of the state now. So which ones are most likely to prey on mule deer? And ultimately, getting at that doesn't have an effect on the actual population. Because we know cougars eat deer, but is it causing a negative effect on the population? That's what we're trying to get at. We can't answer some of these, though. Carnivores most likely to eat mule deer. It's cougars and coyotes. The black bears in where we're at don't really appear to prey on fawns that much, but that could be different. Other areas are Starkey is probably not the best bear habitat in the Blue Mountains, so we probably have a bit lower densities in some other areas. So I'm not saying that this might change a bit in areas where you might have some more bears, but where we're at, it's those two. How many on the landscape? So we have techniques to do this, and we've previously done this. Let's see, almost 10 years ago we started doing this using conservation detection dogs. They go out and locate cougar scat. We can get genetics of the individual cougar that left the scat there, and then run some complicated models to get estimates of how many cougars are on the landscape. So we had done that before in the Mount Emily Wildlife Management Unit. We did it on 2 separate years. Found there's about 0.8 to 2 cougars per 10 square kilometers. Let's say I've got that miles, 10 square miles. And we got similar estimates the 2 years we did the surveys. And so that in Mount Emily, there's probably around 70 to 90 cougars in the Mount Emily Wildlife Management Unit. And for reference, there stretches between Pendleton and LeGrand, and then Highway 204 to the north. This is fairly expensive to do, though. Genetic work is not cheap. We have to contract out to get the detection dogs on site and pay for the lab work. So it runs a fairly big bill, and so we're trying to figure out there's some more cost-effective and efficient ways to do this where we can rely just on in-house staff. And what a lot of this comes through is trying to use trail cameras, which there's some pluses and minuses with that too that we've encountered as we've moved along. But we did work at Starkey where we did have detection dogs come back out again. That's sort of our gold standard estimate. We know that's a quality estimate. And then trying to compare some of the camera estimates to that to see if we get something that's similar and can rely on estimates just from cameras. So we've got a grad student at Oregon State working with us on this, and he's just wrapping this up. But here's in 2017, here's our estimated densities, sort of a range there for each species. So coyotes were at about 6 to 8.5 per 10 square miles. I do have a typo on the bobcats. That's between 2 to 4 per 10 square miles. I accidentally deleted the 10 part. Bears were at about 1.3 to 2.8, and cougars about 0.25 to 0.8. And those appear to be pretty reasonable estimates. We actually had a good chunk of these animals collared too, so we know they were there. And it appeared to match up just sort of what you intuitively think would be out there. Coyotes are the most abundant, followed by bobcats, bears, and then cougars. Just raw numbers of pictures you get on the camera sort of follow that same trend. So these techniques, we have data across multiple years. 2017 is the only year we've gotten analyzed so far. Getting through the trail cam photos, we get like 1 million of them, so it takes a while just to sort through the photos to be able to run the models. But we're getting close, and so we'll start to see if we are getting variation in some of the densities over time and can start trying to tie that back into mule deer survival. And so ultimately, does predation affect mule deer populations? We're still in the middle of the study, so I wouldn't make any definitive conclusions on that yet. But this is just a broader summary on some of the factors influencing mule deer, and this is not just based on work in Oregon. This is the collective body of literature conducted on mule deer. To my knowledge, there are no published studies that identify predation as a driving factor on mule deer population dynamics. The only paper I'm really familiar with was out of Idaho, where they found a small effect that when they severely reduced cougar densities, they saw a slight uptick in survival and recruitment of fawns. The first hard winter they got took away all those gains, and the deer population dropped again. So even that, they didn't conclude that predation was a primary driver. It was largely a nutrition and winter severity issue. And most studies have indicated that the quality of habitat and then the subsequent nutritional condition of the does is going to be your main driver of mule deer population dynamics. That the body condition of does influences this other life history traits. There's carry-on effects if they give birth to small fawns because they're not in good nutritional condition. Those fawns won't be as productive when they're as adults. So nutrition is just a key overarching principle driving most of mule deer population dynamics. And climate, primarily drought and severe winter, also, it plays a role on nutrition. So winter severity, clearly if it's too long or too deep of snow, they're going to burn a lot of calories and end up probably starving to death in the winter. Drought influences their ability to put on fat during the summer. It will influence the quality of forage and the quantity of forage. So all of it ties back into the nutritional condition of these does. That's really the key, because if they have better summer range, they're more likely to be able to make it through a hard winter. They're going to enter winter with more body fat. So it's all just a feedback cycle relating around the body condition of these does that really has a strong effect on mule deer populations. That's the large consensus from many decades of mule deer research conducted throughout Western North America. And I think with that, I'll leave you with that is a cougar kitten that's about 3 weeks old. And not many people get to see him, so I like to throw that out there. One of the advantages of studying mountain cougars.
Questions for the panel? Representative Lively.
Thank you, Representative Witt. So I grew up in northeastern Oregon, and so I find this fascinating. So in the 50s and the 60s when I grew up, we had winters like unheard of winters, and I don't believe the winter specifically at that point, they had to survive somehow, but winter started in November, didn't get over till May, and we had huge amounts of snow and things. It's not to suggest that winters, even short time here, but I'm trying to understand the issue, but there's two issues. One, so if we discover, a lot of this has to do with the health of the deer and the habitat that's available for them to eat. I don't know what the solution, or what could we even look at that would start addressing that, given all the other changes you talked about, whether it's logging, whether it's people living in the forests, whether it's the predators. So I'm trying to understand where this all might lead other than just mule deer disappearing.
Sure, committee members, that is I guess the $1 million question. I think it is going to take a lot of collective efforts across multiple agencies. We're going to have to work with our federal partners that, they're in charge of managing most of the land. We're going to have to work with them and try and identify some habitat prescriptions that will benefit mule deer. Going to have to look at probably land use planning on some of the, ongoing energy developments, taking up some winter range. I just need to strategically start addressing some of this to slow some of these declines. And one key thing about mule deer, though, is they're pretty resilient. When they get good conditions, they will increase rapidly. They have the potential of putting out 2 fawns every year. So if we can provide some good conditions, I think they'll bounce back somewhat on their own, but they are going to need some help with some habitat work. Our habitats have been degraded in certain areas, especially I think sagebrush habitats are going to be another challenge. They've got their own issues separate from forested habitats.
Please.
So elk. So is the elk population in this area increasing? Because I know it is in certain places. We see, at least I see these pictures, but I've heard my friends again in northeastern Oregon, the farmers specifically complaining about elk. So I'm trying to understand, so is the elk population, which evidently what you say, they take their feed in that is a little bit different than deer, or are the elk competing for the same food that mule deer eat?
I'll answer. Chair, Representative Lively, just for the record, my name's Doe Causes. I'm the Wildlife Division Administrator. And a couple things. First off, to go back to your first question, the agency started a mule deer initiative, which was really to try to address this declining population. It's been 9-10 years ago now that we started it, and literally we have financed the removal of, for instance, tens of thousands of acres of juniper Juniper
yeah.
encroachment is definitely an issue
Remember hearing
with
that.
mule deer, but there's a lot of other habitat issues that, we can't address. Certain things like fire can be good as long as we're not, it's not too hot. But one of the main things about, kind of getting towards your second question, about mule deer and elk is that they are very much different animals. So Darren said many times that deer are browsers. They prefer browse of woody stems. They don't survive well on grass. Very limited times of the year will they survive on grass, whereas elk, having a much bigger stomach, relatively speaking, they can survive on a lot of lower quality foods like dry grass. But when it comes to competition of elk and deer, I can actually say a quote from Darren's predecessor that, elk can eat everything a deer can eat plus 50% more. And so they literally can outcompete, just not even physically, but just consuming much more vegetation than a deer could, including everything a deer would eat.
And is the elk population growing?
Yes, and not necessarily everywhere, but they are, unfortunately, and a lot of our damage issues right now are elk being redistributed.
Oh,
Because very much similar to what's going on with mule deer, we have a forage problem on a lot of our national forests. And so elk, and they can live a long time, smart enough to figure out these agricultural fields are the place that they're going to be fat and happy, and they'll stay. And they will remember. So it's trying to improve forage for both deer and elk on our public lands is a big deal.
good. Thank you.
Representative Gorsuch.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In keeping with this kind of idea of competition, there was a little bit of mention about cattle. Is there possibly something that we could do in terms of restricting the range of the cattle versus the mule deer, or is that something we don't have any control over because it's Forest Service?
Chair Representative Gorsuch, cattle are a challenge. That is, Forest Service or BLM is the permit holder for that, and so they do get to authorize how many cattle are out there. So it will be an ongoing challenge. Cattle are also a competitor with elk and mule deer, and one of the real issues and it diverges a bit between cattle and mule deer because their diets don't overlap a ton until late summer. Sort of the cattle, elk, and mule deer all get to the spots that are still the greenest out there, which is typically north-facing slopes in late summer. So
That makes sense.
then they all start eating similar things because that's all that's left. So that's one of the primary times. We do cattle research also at the Starkey Experimental Forest, but we actually don't have full control over how many cattle are grazed currently. So that's another confounding issue. If we get more control over that, we'll probably investigate also reducing cattle numbers in there and seeing how that might potentially benefit mule deer also.
All right, thank you.
Representative Reardon.
Well, thank you. Well, thanks for being here. This is really interesting. You have a much more interesting job than I do, so I want to. But anyway, this committee has heard a lot about cougars lately, and over the years, actually.
That's right.
And I noticed that the greatest density of predators was the cougars. So, in your research, does that have you done any research about how hunting practices might impact the population of cougars?
Representative Reardon, Oregon has specifically not done any research related to hunting pressure on cougars, but there's been lots of it done throughout the western United States. We have one of the unique situations where we don't get to use hounds to hunt cougars. So most of the research has been done in areas where that is allowed. And most management is based on source sink dynamics. So you can with enough hunting pressure, locally reduce cougar populations in a small area, and then you can rely on areas that get less hunting pressure to keep recolonizing that area. So you have your source populations that are lightly hunted, and then your sink populations where you usually have higher hunting pressure. In Oregon, we struggle to do that given our system. Harvest is largely opportunistic. The bulk of it occurs during fall, during other hunting seasons for deer and elk, and it's really opportunistic. We can't really set up that source sink sort of dynamic where we're going to put a lot of pressure in one area to, say, greatly reduce the cougar population in that, say, wildlife management unit. But the other consensus on hunting, you have to usually probably pretty heavy pressure on a localized area to get the reduction locally, but the populations are extremely resilient and will bounce back from harvest very well.
And I think that's consistent with what we've heard here, that they will bounce back even maybe higher levels, so because of their tribal nature. And so, okay, interesting.
Yeah.
To what extent do we need to be concerned about increasing wolf populations and their impact on mule deer populations?
Sure. So we have done a little bit of research on wolves in Oregon. So we recently just wrapped up stuff looking at some of their diet and competition with cougars. The diet of wolves in Oregon is largely dominated by elk, and that's consistent with every study in Western North America where elk occur. They're going to be the primary prey of wolves, and it's somewhere around 75 to 80% of their diet in Oregon was wolves. Granted, it's in the Blue Mountains. As they get to some areas where there's fewer elk and it's more mule deer, they'll probably have more mule deer in their diet. But at this time, I would not, given that wolves prey mostly on elk, I wouldn't expect them to be a big concern for mule deer, especially in the short term, given the number of wolves we have in the state. They're still increasing and recolonizing portions. So from a mule deer standpoint, short term definitely would not be concerned about wolf predation. For elk, it may become an issue as we get more wolves established.
And I recognize we didn't invite you to talk about elk necessarily today, but I did hear a presentation a couple of years ago where wolves have the direct impact of an actual kill with elk, but also will oftentimes get on a herd of elk and just chase them, and it becomes difficult during breeding season then for the cows to even become pregnant. And I don't know if that's true or not. And again, recognizing we didn't invite you here for the elk presentation, but I'm just curious whether that in fact is if you know if that's true.
Chair, committee members, that is an ongoing area of debate in several scientific papers. Some of the initial work suggested that was the case. Some newer work coming out with more GPS color data suggests elk don't actually interact that frequently with wolves. Wolves cover a big area. Once they're on the other side of their territory, that elk's not real concerned about a wolf. So yes, they're a coursing predator. They chase elk. They're going to run them. I think some of the newer work showing that pregnancy rates really aren't that affected. Elk are afraid of wolves, but it's not this constant rundown. I'm terrified every second of my life because there's. And
do increasing populations of white-tailed deer have any adverse impact, or are they kind of in a different habitat?
Chair Witt, committee members, they are definitely also competitors with mule deer. The current distribution of white-tailed deer, they're typically more associated with ag lands closer to valley bottoms. So large chunks of the year, the two species most of the population won't even interact with each other. They're probably more likely to interact on winter range habitat because that's the lowland areas are where the mule deer are trying to get to. Could be a concern. We haven't put a whole lot of resources into looking at that one, given the sheer number of elk on the landscape, competition with elk would probably be a bigger issue than white-tailed deer at this time.
I'm also curious, and I know that your study's still young, so you don't have the benefit of a number of years, but it has the appearance, at least from a hunter in the field, and you know, all of that is it could be just observation, and there's no basis in reality to it. But it has the appearance that Oregon's mule deer population is more challenged than some of our neighboring states. And if we were looking at nutrition, habitat, and climate, you know, maybe our forest condition has changed more rapidly than some of the other states. But as I look at the very long-term decline since the late 80s, it just seems like there would have been an opportunity at some point for that population to reverse the decline, and it's suggestive of that we've really missed the boat on something. And whether it's our forest health or whatever, again, the study may not be old enough to be able to start making those calls, but as policymakers, as the people who receive complaints from hunters, as you all do in your office too, what are there any trends at this point that would be suggestive of things that we truly need to be focusing on?
Chair Witt, committee members, I think the biggest thing for us to focus on is trying to work with our partners to improve habitat.
Yeah.
That is probably what's going on. Talking to my colleagues in Idaho and other places, they're all looking at habitat-related issues also.
Yeah.
You had mentioned at one point about it looked like we might be doing a little bit worse in some of the surrounding states. Largely our habitat conditions for ungulates, so deer and elk, is not as high a quality as some of the Rocky Mountain states. They do have, they get more snowpack, they have more moisture than we do, so they a lot of times get better nutritional resources. That's been demonstrated with elk, with some of the work our collaborators have done throughout the West, that elk definitely do better in the Rocky Mountain states. Ours are more nutritionally stressed in the Blue Mountains and the Cascades. But getting back, I think it is habitat is where we should spend most of our resources. As Doug mentioned earlier, it will help with some of our elk distribution issues also if we can improve forage conditions in sort of the natural habitats and forested areas. So I think there's multiple benefits to doing that, but it is a challenge since we don't directly get to go out and manipulate habitat to benefit deer and elk. We got to work with our partners.
Well, as we move forward with a number of bills dealing with wildfire, they have a lot to do with other things, habitat, in addition to fire itself. And your study may be exceedingly timely in terms of yet another avenue of input into what we need to be doing to successfully manage a lot of our forest and rangeland ecosystems. So I don't know if you ever have the opportunity to work kind of interdepartmental, interagency to share that kind of information. But I'm really sensing that a lot of what you're going to have, the information that you're going to produce is just going to underscore a lot of concerns about forest and rangeland management needs.
Chair Witt, committee members, I should have mentioned also the research at Starkey is not just an ODFW project. This has been a long-term collaboration with the Forest Service.
With the Forest Service,
so they
yes.
are they're directly involved. They know these results. I work in a Forest Service building with our Forest Service colleagues. But we are involved. I've given this presentation, also some presentations on elk to local forest collaboratives in the Blue Mountains. So we are trying to get this information out, especially to decision makers, and talking with some of our other folks in the Blue Mountains. They're coming to us asking for input on some of the forest management projects they're trying to push through, and just seeing if they'd be beneficial to deer or elk. So we definitely have those conversations. It's just things move slower on the federal side than I think we'd like them to get a project through.
Well, we can show them a better way, right? Anything further?
Mr. Chair? I just have one more diet question. So you talked about, I believe in that area, you talked about trying to supplement their diet in the wintertime. I believe I've seen elk eating in the fields where we put out hay for cattle. But so given the little difference in the diet, what possibly can we supplement that would provide, I guess, increasing nutrition of that for the deer versus, I mean, hay is, some type of hay is what we feed the cattle in that, so.
Chair Whip, Representative Lively, I probably wouldn't advocate for feeding ungulates. There's all sorts of problems that become associated with that, some disease transmission issues by concentrating them. And anything you would put out to try and benefit mule deer is going to attract lots of elk.
Yeah.
And the elk would probably dominate it. I don't know, Doug might have some follow-ups on feeding, but from a research side of it, it's not something we really even want to encourage as a practice to try and benefit the species.
Yeah, Chair Witt, Representative Lively, we do feed some winter feed on some of our wildlife areas, and it's originally designed to reduce damage on private agricultural lands nearby.
Sure.
During the winter range, it's not about trying to increase their numbers or provide better nutrition for them. And now, with the advent of chronic wasting disease, as you see, that there's definitely more and more concern about feeding for whatever reason.
Yeah, I'm sure.
And you've seen the reports out of Wyoming about the elk refuge there, how CWD is being, well, the artificial feeding they're doing is a big concern, and it's becoming more and more of a concern to us, and it's something that we do have to consider, especially when it comes to feeding elk in the future. But artificial feeding in the winter, like in the winter of 16-17, becomes a big cry from the hunters and the communities where all these deer are dying. It's a terrible thing, but winter feeding on a scale that would do anything is impossible.
Impossible.
Literally impossible. So it's one of those very difficult things for us to deal with the social issues of all these animals dying and the ability not to help them.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Anything further? That was just an amazing presentation, very, very interesting. And as I mentioned, receive a lot of complaints, and it's always the predators, and we have too many wolves, we have too many coyotes, we have too many, whatever. And this really suggests that we need to be doing a better job on habitat management, and we would be a lot better placed to be focusing on that rather than trying to go out and scorched earth on carnivore predators. So certainly appreciate all of your fine work and your appearance here today. It just truly an interesting presentation. Thank you so very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks
Anything for the good of the order? I'm not seeing anything. With that, we stand adjourned. Thank you very much. Thanks again, folks. Truly appreciate it.